No one ever won power by winning an argument. You don't rise by being right, you rise by being undeniable. In every room where power is contested, boardrooms, battlefields, courtrooms, or even dinner tables, the loudest voice rarely wins. Words fly, opinions clash, egos inflate. But while others talk, the real players move. And in the end, it is not the person who argued best who wins, it's the one whose actions shifted the game. Arguments are the weapon of the powerless. When you lack leverage, when you crave validation, when you can't do, you talk. Loudly, desperately. You try to convince. But in power games, convincing is weakness. Because when you argue, you expose your need for agreement. You reveal your insecurities. You enter a battlefield where the very act of engaging makes you smaller. Winners don't argue. They act. Their strategy unfolds in silence, not in debates, but in decisions, not in counterpoints, but in consequences. They understand that actions bypass resistance. While words invite friction and defensive posturing, actions operate beneath the surface, triggering emotional, subconscious responses that no argument ever could. Think of how the human brain processes information. Logical reasoning is slow, effortful, and easily biased. But perception, emotion, and instinct, they are lightning fast. When someone makes a bold move, exits a meeting, shuts down a negotiation, launches a product, walks away from a toxic partner, the signal is received immediately and viscerally. That person just communicated strength. They didn't need approval. They didn't ask to be understood. They showed. In contrast, arguments activate the wrong systems in others. When you try to win with words, the listener instinctively looks for flaws in your logic, holes in your evidence, reasons to resist. You create an opponent. But when you act, especially with precision and control, there is often nothing to push against. Your message becomes reality, not opinion. You become the authority by behaving like one. This law is critical in a world where status is fluid and attention is scarce. Every second you're speaking, justifying, explaining, persuading, you're draining your power. You're giving the audience the illusion of equality, or worse, superiority. But when you move without explanation, when your results speak, the equation flips. You generate mystique. People become curious. You're no longer just another voice in the noise. You're the force that makes things happen. That's why the most strategic players in history avoided debates like poison. They knew that verbal victory often creates lasting resentment. Win the argument, and the other person walks away humiliated, plotting revenge. Win with action, and they may not even realize they've lost until it's too late. In martial arts, there's a principle: never meet force with force. If someone pushes you, don't push back. Step aside, redirect, and let their momentum undo them. The same is true in psychological warfare. Don't resist with words. Don't try to overpower their opinion. Let them talk. Let them believe. Then act in a way that makes their argument obsolete. The greatest generals don't threaten. They mobilize. The best negotiators don't overpromise. They create outcomes. The most magnetic leaders don't talk about confidence. They walk into rooms like they already own them. This doesn't mean silence is always the answer. It means timing is everything. Words should be rare, sharp, and layered with intention. But the default must be action, because only through action do you gain momentum, credibility, and control. Power belongs to those who can move the pieces, not those who argue about how the board should be played. So remember, every time you feel the urge to explain yourself, to argue your point, to defend your position, stop, breathe, Ask, what can I do that renders this entire argument irrelevant? What actions speak so loudly no one dares question me after? Speak only when the silence would damage your position more than the sound. Napoleon Bonaparte, the general who let his cannons speak. In the winter of 1795, France was on the edge of implosion. The revolution had decapitated the monarchy. Chaos reigned in Paris, and the government, the weak and fragmented Directory, was barely holding on. Royalist forces threatened to retake the capital. Politicians argued, the press screamed, but amidst all the noise, one silent, sharp-eyed artillery officer was watching. Napoleon Bonaparte. He didn't argue. He didn't write pamphlets or give speeches. He didn't try to convince the factions to trust him. Instead, he positioned his cannons. When the Royalists launched their assault on the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon ordered grape shot to be fired directly into the mob. The confrontation lasted mere hours. Hundreds fell. The revolution and the Directory survived. And just like that, a 26-year-old officer became the most feared and respected man in France. No debate, no negotiation, just action. The rise begins. After that moment, now famously known as the whiff of grape shot, Napoleon didn't beg for promotions. They came to him. Within months, he was given command of the Army of Italy. Again, he didn't engage in rhetorical debates or court public favor. He focused on movement. Napoleon led a ragged, starving army across the Alps and crushed the Austrian forces with speed and brilliance that stunned all of Europe. His letters home were terse and strategic, not poetic pleas for glory, but dispatches laced with precision. He let results narrate his legend. While his enemies printed insults and warnings, Napoleon printed maps and moved troops. While politicians schemed and criticized, Napoleon redrew borders. He negotiated peace with Austria, not with flowery persuasion, but with battlefield victories that made further resistance unthinkable. He didn't need their approval. He gave them outcomes. The Egyptian campaign, a study in image over words. In 1798, Napoleon launched the Egyptian campaign, a military venture that would ultimately fail strategically but still elevate his myth. Why? Because even when the outcome was mixed, he controlled the narrative through actions, not excuses. When his fleet was destroyed by the British at the Battle of the Nile, many expected a retreat or a torrent of justification. Instead, Napoleon pushed inland, won battles against the Mamluks, and had his scholars begin documenting the expedition in what would become Description de l'Égypte, a monumental scientific and cultural work. Even in partial defeat, Napoleon shaped perception. He didn't debate the failure. He redefined the campaign as a civilizational contribution through visible deeds, construction, discoveries. The ultimate move, the coup of 18 Brumaire. In 1799, the French government collapsed again into squabbling. Napoleon returned from Egypt, watched quietly as the Directory imploded in arguments and indecision, and acted. In a single day, 18 Brumaire, he executed a bloodless coup. No rousing speech to the public, no persuasive essays to justify his power grab. He walked into the council chambers with armed guards, dismissed the legislators, and declared the end of the Directory. Within hours, he was first consul. Again, no argument, just control. He let his enemies exhaust themselves in rhetoric, then moved. Legacy, the language of action. By the time Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, literally taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head, the symbolism was complete. He didn't ask for permission. He took it. Throughout his reign, Napoleon used action as his primary communications strategy. He reformed law with the Napoleonic Code. He reshaped the continent with campaigns that left entire empires reeling. He didn't engage in prolonged debates with kings. He maneuvered them into treaties or destroyed them on the battlefield. When exiled to Elba after his first fall, he didn't waste time defending himself. He escaped, landed in France, walked toward Paris, and as he marched, soldiers sent to stop him joined him. No manifesto, no debates, just presence, just movement. By the time he reached the capital, the king had fled, without a shot fired. That was power. The core pattern. In every major moment of his rise, Napoleon applied the same psychological pattern. Let others argue while you act. Control outcomes, not opinions. Shape perception through undeniable results. He understood that the public may not remember your arguments, but they remember what you built, what you took, what you won. His silence was never weakness. It was anticipation. He let the world speak until he had something too big to ignore. That's why, centuries later, we still study him not for what he said, but for what he did. Why? This law works. The psychology of power. Without words. Words are cheap. Anyone can say anything. But in the world of power, results are sacred. This law thrives on the deep wiring of human psychology, biology, and social behavior. Because in the end, we are not convinced by what people say, but by what they do. Let's break it down. 1. The brain filters words. It reacts to results. Neurologically, when we hear an argument, our prefrontal cortex lights up, the part of the brain that processes reasoning, logic, and abstract thinking. It's the courtroom of the mind. Sounds smart, but here's the problem. This is also the part of the brain most active when we're being defensive. When someone argues, the brain doesn't say, "Oh, a fair point." It says, "Am I under attack?" It starts looking for flaws, counter-arguments, and justifications to protect your current beliefs. That's cognitive dissonance. Your brain hates being proven wrong, so it fights back. But when you see someone act, your brain doesn't engage in logic. It processes the effect. You don't need to explain that a person is powerful if they walk into a room and everyone stands up. The body recognizes dominance immediately. That's because actions speak to the limbic brain, the primal emotional core, which doesn't argue. It feels, reacts, remembers. That's why you can forget a conversation, but remember a moment someone showed up for you forever. Nishi, 2. Arguments create ego wars. No one wins. When you argue, you may believe you're appealing to reason, but in the power game, you're signaling weakness. Why? Because arguing is a sign you're trying to convince. And trying to convince implies you don't yet own the outcome. Powerful people don't need to convince. They execute. Moreover, arguments rarely stay objective. They become personal. You're not just debating ideas, you're clashing egos. The moment you step into an argument, you activate a zero-sum game. I win, you lose. No one wants to lose, so they escalate. They dig in. And even if you win the argument, you've now created an enemy. This is why smart leaders don't argue. They redirect. Or better, they stay silent, act, and let the result silence everyone else. Third, action creates authority without permission. In every hierarchy, from the Roman Empire to a startup team, authority isn't always assigned. It's often claimed through results. You can talk about how much you know, how much you deserve, how right you are, and people may nod. But if you deliver repeatedly and visibly, you become the one others defer to. That's demonstrated status. In leadership, this is gold. A CEO who outperforms projections doesn't need to speak in meetings. Their presence is authority. A general who wins battles commands fear and respect, not because of words, but because of results. This is the non-verbal economy of power. Every win, every move, every execution becomes a silent resume burned into people's subconscious. And people obey resumes they feel, not ones they read. Fourth demonstration equals irrefutable reality. You can debate philosophy, you can challenge logic, but you cannot argue with the result. You can say someone isn't a genius, but you can't argue with their $100 million company. You can say someone isn't strong, but you can't argue with their physical dominance. You can say someone isn't disciplined, but not when they've woken up at 5 a.m. for 10 years. That's why the best leaders show, not tell. Great seducers don't say, "I'm romantic." They create unforgettable moments. Great tacticians don't say, "I'm right." They win. Great creators don't explain their process. They put the finished masterpiece on the wall. Demonstration ends discussion. 5. Silence builds power. The absence of argument is a statement in itself. When someone criticizes you and you don't respond, you create uncertainty. Is he above it? Is he calculating? Is he right? The silence plants doubt, mystery, fear, which are far more psychologically destabilizing than a counterattack. Silence creates pressure. The mind of the other person races to fill the gap. Often, your silence says more than words ever could. It signals calm, control, and confidence. 3 undeniable indicators of power. And when finally you do act, the release of tension hits like a hammer. 6. In seduction and influence, action is the language of power. Words are negotiable, actions aren't. In influence, whether you're selling, dating, leading, or negotiating, people are conditioned to doubt words. We've all heard too many empty promises, fake compliments, or clever lies. But when someone acts in a way that benefits, protects, or impresses you, it creates an emotional imprint. Think of someone who argued about loving you versus someone who simply showed up every time it mattered, or someone who said they'd support your project versus someone who actually opened a door for you. Influence doesn't come from verbal power. It comes from being the person who makes things happen, who takes the call, makes the introduction, delivers the product, creates the moment. In seduction and persuasion, this is what earns loyalty, not logic. 7. The world doesn't reward intention. It rewards execution. In modern culture, especially on social media, it's easy to confuse talk for progress. People post plans, share ideas, argue in comment sections, but nothing moves. That's why, in business, war, and leadership, people follow those who move the needle. In fact, the more powerful you are, the less you should talk, because talking dilutes mystery. The moment you try to justify or convince, you shift the frame from control to insecurity. Real leaders don't ask to be seen, they simply do, and let the world adjust around them. Final thought. Power respects results, not rhetoric. The brain is wired to distrust words, but obey action. The higher the stakes, the less you explain. And the more you act, the more your silence speaks volumes. In the end, it's not what you say that shapes your legacy. It's what people remember you did. Secondary examples, when actions made the argument obsolete. 1. Steve Jobs, 1 slide, 1 sentence, 1 revolution. In 2007, Steve Jobs walked on stage, wearing a black turtleneck and jeans. He didn't argue why Apple was better. He didn't debate specs, markets, or competitors. Instead, he calmly said, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone." Then, he showed the iPhone. No tech wars, no verbal jabs at Microsoft or BlackBerry. Just a single clean act that shifted the course of global communication forever. It wasn't a product launch, It was a power move. He didn't explain why Apple would win. He demonstrated it. From that moment, the industry had to respond, and not with words, but with their own redesigns. That's real power, when your action forces the world to reorganize itself around you. 2. Julius Caesar, crossing the Rubicon. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon River, the boundary between his territory and Rome. Roman law forbade generals from bringing armies into Italy. Doing so was an act of war. Caesar didn't argue with the Senate. He didn't publish manifestos. He didn't beg for recognition. He crossed the Rubicon. That single act was louder than any speech. It made negotiation impossible. He didn't request power. He claimed it. Rome fell into civil war. And Caesar, he marched to Rome, took control, and became dictator for life. His enemies had words. Caesar had momentum. 3. Angela Merkel, silent dominance in the EU. Angela Merkel rarely gave fiery speeches. She wasn't known for rhetorical flourishes or media charisma. In fact, early in her career, many criticized her for being boring. But what Merkel did was deliver stability. In crisis after crisis, from the Eurozone collapse to the migrant influx, she acted decisively while others debated. Her method was simple: under-promise, over-deliver. While male politicians in Europe held press conferences, she built quiet coalitions, secured economic deals, and made Germany the unshakable center of European power. In the end, Merkel didn't dominate through argument. She dominated through results. And in a continent of debate, she became the only one people trusted to act. 4. Michael Jordan, no trash talk needed. In a league full of loudmouths and ego clashes, Michael Jordan didn't need to argue. He was the best. He showed up and won. 6 championships, 5 MVPs. A legacy that speaks louder than any interview. Opponents would trash talk him. Jordan would drop 40 points and walk off the court. He didn't need words. He needed the scoreboard. In one legendary moment, a rookie dared to mock him during warm-ups. Jordan didn't reply. He just stared. That night, he annihilated the kid's team, then simply said, "Don't ever talk trash to Black Jesus." That's power. Not because he said it, but because it was true. 5. Shinzo Abe and the quiet rise of Japan's global power. As Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe rarely made global headlines with provocative statements or high-profile diplomatic drama. Instead, his leadership style was invisible influence. While China projected dominance, Abe quietly rewrote Japan's defense policies, signed long-term trade deals, expanded Japan's global alliances, and restructured the economy for long-term resilience. No noise, no bombast, just decades of execution. By the time world leaders realized what had changed, Japan had become a central pillar in the Indo-Pacific, not by arguing its case, but by building its position. Pattern summary: the silent operators win. In all of these stories, one truth repeats. Jobs didn't say Apple would dominate. He showed a phone that did. Caesar didn't ask for Rome. He marched into it. Merkel didn't fight for attention. She acted while others debated. Jordan didn't talk about greatness. He delivered it, game after game. Abe didn't argue with rising powers. He strengthened his own without noise. Each one ignored the argument and made the action the final word. Beginner mistakes. When words betray power. The most dangerous place in a power game is not at the bottom. It's in the middle, where you have just enough intelligence to form arguments, but not enough control to enforce them. That's where rookies live. They think power comes from being right. They think they can argue their way to respect. They think people respond to logic, not leverage. Let's break down the most common and deadly mistakes beginners make when violating this law. 1. Over-explaining. The death of authority. Rookies often confuse clarity with credibility. They feel the need to explain everything, their reasons, their feelings, their justifications. But in power dynamics, over-explaining weakens your stance. When a leader changes direction and feels compelled to offer 10 paragraphs of rationale, they signal uncertainty. When a team member messes up and spends 5 minutes explaining why it wasn't their fault, they look guilty, not accountable. Powerful people don't explain. They declare, they decide, they deliver. Think of a judge handing down a sentence. They don't offer personal context. The gavel drops, it's final. Every extra word you add is a chance to lose control of the frame. Power communicates in headlines, not essays. Oh. 2. Getting sucked into debates. There's a seductive trap that devours new minds. The desire to win the argument. It feels good to be right, to have the facts, to expose flaws in the other side's thinking. But every moment spent debating is a moment you're not moving. Words are air. Action is gravity. If you have to argue, you've already lost altitude. Real players don't enter debates. They position themselves so others can't afford to disagree. In corporate settings, this looks like a junior manager who argues a strategy in meetings versus a senior exec who quietly aligns stakeholders and delivers a working prototype that nobody can ignore. In dating, this looks like someone texting long emotional essays versus someone who disappears, builds their life, and becomes magnetic again through sheer presence. The powerful don't debate. They act in ways that make debates irrelevant. 3. The addiction to being right. Truth and power don't always live in the same room. Beginners often obsess over being correct, thinking the world will reward them for it. But life doesn't hand out trophies for accuracy. It rewards influence. There are brilliant people on internet forums with zero power, and there are billionaires who make poor arguments but own the systems. Being right is a tactic. Being effective is the goal. The obsession with being right leads you to seek validation. It makes you reactive. It makes you defend, rather than shape. Ask yourself this: would you rather be applauded for your reasoning or obeyed for your results? 4. Trying to win with emotion or volume. Another mistake, assuming intensity equals impact. Many beginners think that by being more passionate, louder, or more emotionally expressive, they'll win the argument. But in power psychology, emotional intensity signals lower status. The more reactive you are, the less in control you seem. This is why powerful people often speak slowly, even when provoked. Their calm creates discomfort in others. It signals that they're not worried, because they've already decided how this ends. If you raise your voice, lose composure, or get pulled into emotional appeals, you've already surrendered the high ground. Power is cold fire. It burns, but it doesn't flinch. 5. Trying to change people's minds with logic alone. The human mind doesn't operate like a courtroom. It operates like a survival system. When you present someone with facts that challenge their ego, identity, or tribe, they don't listen. They dig in. They resist. And yet, beginners often try to persuade with logic, charts, or bullet points, assuming rationality will win the day. It won't. But show someone that everyone else is doing it, and they'll follow. Show them a successful result, and they'll copy it. Show them power, and they'll bow. Don't argue your ideas. Demonstrate them. Make them desirable, not debatable. 6. Letting the need to explain yourself undermine finality. Beginner mistake. You make a strong decision, but then someone pushes back, and you fold, trying to soften the blow with explanations. Suddenly, the decision feels open for negotiation. This happens in relationships, in leadership, in creative direction. When you revisit decisions because of someone's discomfort, you signal that your authority is negotiable. Power doesn't require cruelty, but it does require finality. Once you act, let the action stand. Let the silence grow around it. Let others adapt to your move, instead of adapting to their emotions. 7. Trying to win the conversation instead of the game. Perhaps the deepest mistake. Viewing power as a verbal competition rather than a strategic war. Beginners want to win arguments. Masters want to win timelines. They don't care who sounds smarter in the moment. They care who has more leverage 6 months later. If you spend your time explaining, persuading, and battling for immediate wins, you waste the energy that should be going into building quiet advantage. While others talk, you should be executing. When they notice, it's too late. That's how power moves. Final thought. Words are tools, not weapons. If you use them too much, they become dull. If you lean on them, instead of results, they expose your weakness. Don't try to win the debate, win the game. And when you do, let your actions speak so loudly, no one dares challenge your silence. Actionable tactics, how to speak the language of results. In a world flooded with opinions, the rarest signal is undeniable action. This law doesn't just warn you against arguing, it gives you a new vocabulary, one made of movement, not words. Here's how to live and lead by it. 1. Go silent when emotion rises. The moment you feel the urge to prove a point, pause. Silence is the heaviest weight in a conversation. It causes others to fill the space. And in power games, whoever talks less usually leads more. Use silence as a strategy when you're being provoked. Someone challenges your authority. You're tempted to justify your decision. Instead of reacting, let your opponent expose their own insecurity. Silence is not retreat. It's the chamber where strategy is loaded. 2. Design actions that cannot be argued with. The most devastating response to criticism? Success. You don't argue with a critic. You build something undeniable. Instead of debating your skills, publish the product. Instead of explaining your plan, launch the pilot. Instead of defending your ability, win the client. Think of your life as a courtroom, but you're not a lawyer. You're the evidence. Make it impossible to argue with you by giving them something they can't ignore. Results, proof of concept, transformation, performance. Nobody argues with momentum. They either follow it or get crushed by it. 3. Turn criticism into fuel, not dialogue. When people attack your ideas, ego wants to respond. Don't. Respond through execution. Imagine someone says, "That business will never work." You don't say, "Actually, based on market trends and my projections," you go build it. You get users. You show screenshots. When you respond with action, you do 2 things. 1. Maintain power by staying above the emotional bait. 2. Send a message. I don't argue. I outperform. That message spreads fast. 4. Use the 3-point pressure system. If you must speak, combine it with action pressure. The formula: say once, act quickly, stay silent. Example: this team needs tighter deadlines. Say it once. Implement a shorter sprint cycle immediately. Don't revisit it in meetings unless results require change. Stay silent. The first statement frames you as clear. The second proves you're serious. The third forces others to adjust or get left behind. Conclusion: the quiet force that moves mountains. Power does not shout. It does not justify, beg, or explain. It moves silently, like gravity, undeniable, inescapable, and felt long before it's understood. In a world addicted to noise, the one who remains calm becomes terrifying. While others spill words in endless justification, the powerful individual lets outcomes speak for them, not because they can't argue, but because they don't have to. There's a deep elegance in restraint, a brutal finality in result, an authority that cannot be faked when your fingerprints are on real change. This law teaches more than strategy. It teaches posture, the posture of those who know they can win, not by convincing others, but by moving first, deeper, and better. Think of the generals who never explained their plans, only unveiled victories. Think of the entrepreneurs who ignored doubt, then launched revolutions. Think of the leaders whose silence made others listen harder. Words are brittle. They snap under scrutiny. Actions, if crafted well, are indestructible. They become legend. They leave no rebuttal. To follow this law is to rewire your identity. You are not a debater. You are not here to win arguments. You are here to move things, change things, and build things that make arguments irrelevant. This is not passivity. This is precision. It is the confidence to let others speak while you watch. It is the focus to channel your energy into impact, not defense. And it is the long-term vision to understand that in the game of power, those who act own the future. One day, someone will try to bait you. Someone will demand you explain yourself, justify your worth, prove your position. That is your test. Will you lower your status by engaging on their level? Or will you raise the stakes by doing what they fear most, proving them wrong without saying a word? Your choice will define your power. In the end, the most formidable person in the room is not the loudest, the wittiest, or the best at debate. It is the one whose silence makes others nervous, whose calmness signals certainty, whose movement leaves a trail too clear to contest. Be that person. Let your actions be your sharpest blade. Let your results be your voice. And let your silence make the loudest noise of all. If this law struck a chord, if you're done wasting words and ready to lead through impact, subscribe. This channel isn't entertainment. It's an edge, a blueprint for power in the real world. And next time, we go deeper, into darkness, into contagion. Law 10, infection. Avoid the unhappy and unlucky. We'll expose how negativity spreads faster than failure, how emotions are viruses, and why one wrong connection can rot everything you've built. Don't miss it.